I believed my lover from Oman because Rashid had a way of making the impossible feel inevitable, his voice steady and warm like the desert wind that carried stories across centuries. We met in London, where I worked as a translator for an international law firm, and he was completing his master's degree in environmental engineering at Imperial College. The first time he approached me at a cafe near the British Library, I was drowning in Arabic legal documents, and he offered to help with a particularly tricky passage about water rights. His English was impeccable, his manner gentle, and when he smiled, something in my chest shifted like tectonic plates realigning. Within weeks, we were inseparable, and within months, I believed I'd found the person I'd spend my life with. But there was always something strange about Rashid, a careful choreography to how he moved through spaces, and it took me far too long to notice the one consistent peculiarity. He never let me near windows. If I walked toward one, he'd gently redirect me with a touch on my arm or a suggestion we sit elsewhere. If we were in a restaurant, he'd insist on interior tables. In his flat, heavy curtains stayed perpetually drawn, and when I questioned it, he'd say he preferred privacy or that the London light gave him headaches. I accepted these explanations because love makes us credulous, because I wanted to believe, and because the alternative, that something was fundamentally wrong, was too frightening to consider. Our relationship deepened through the autumn and winter of that year, each day revealing new layers of compatibility and affection. Rashid was brilliant, passionate about sustainable development in arid regions, and spoke eloquently about bringing clean water technology to communities across the Middle East. He introduced me to Omani culture through food he'd cook in his small kitchen, shua, hares, dates stuffed with nuts, and through stories about growing up in Muscat with the sea on one side and mountains on the other. His family sounded warm and traditional, and he showed me photographs of his mother in colorful hijab, his father in a traditional dishdasha, his younger sisters laughing on a beach. He talked about taking me to Oman to meet them, about showing me Nizwa Fort and the wadis where water carved through rock, about diving in the waters off the Daymanid Islands. These dreams felt solid, our future together mapped like the geography he studied. But the window thing persisted, becoming a quirk I noted but didn't interrogate. When I suggested opening curtains to let in rare London sunshine, Rashid would tense almost imperceptibly before making excuses. When we walked through parks, he'd steer us away from overlooks and observation points. Once, at a friend's party in a high-rise apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Thames, Rashid became so uncomfortable we left early, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly as we descended in the elevator. I confronted him about it finally on a February evening when frustration overcame tact. We were in his flat, curtains drawn as always despite it being barely 6 in the evening, and I asked directly why he was so strange about windows. Rashid's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, calculation, resignation, before he took my hands and told me a story I had no reason to disbelieve. In Oman, he said, his family had been involved in a political situation, nothing dangerous but sensitive, related to disputes over government contracts for water infrastructure projects. His father had spoken publicly about corruption, and while nothing overtly threatening had happened, there had been subtle intimidations, cars following them, phone calls with no one speaking, photographs of family members taken from positions that suggested surveillance. When Rashid came to London for his studies, his father had warned him to be careful, to maintain low visibility, to avoid being photographed or observed from public spaces. "It sounds paranoid," Rashid admitted, "but in Oman, in the Gulf generally, these things are real. Families can be targeted for years over political disagreements. I keep away from windows because I don't know who might be watching, who might use my location against my family back home." He was earnest, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that felt like honesty. I believed him because the explanation fit with what I knew about Gulf politics, because dissidents and activists did face real dangers, and because I wanted to believe that this was the worst secret my relationship held. 4 months after that conversation, I not only accepted Rashid's precautions but adopted them myself, becoming complicit in the choreography of avoidance. We lived carefully, always in interior spaces, always with curtains drawn, always navigating the city as if under invisible surveillance. When Rashid suggested I take down my social media profiles, just to be safe, they could track you through association with me, I complied. When he asked me not to mention him to certain colleagues or friends, I agreed. Love and caution became intertwined, and I felt almost noble about it, as if I was protecting both him and his family from some distant but real threat. Rashid finished his master's degree with distinction and received a job offer from an international consulting firm specializing in water security projects. The position would involve traveling to Oman regularly, and he seemed both excited and anxious about returning to his home country. He asked if I'd come with him eventually, marry him, build a life that spanned both London and Muscat. I said yes without hesitation, imagining a future of work and love and two homes bridging cultures. We celebrated with dinner in a dim restaurant tucked in Soho's back streets. No windows, just candlelight and promises. But love built on partial truths is foundations like sand, and mine began shifting when my friend Julia, who worked for the Foreign Office, casually mentioned over coffee that she'd seen someone who looked exactly like Rashid in photographs from a security briefing. "There's this Omani businessman under investigation," she said, scrolling through her phone. "He looks just like your boyfriend. Same face, but older. Is Rashid related to anyone in the defense sector?" She showed me the photograph. A man in his 50s, distinguished, wearing traditional Gulf attire, standing next to officials at some kind of ceremony. The resemblance to Rashid was striking enough that it could be his father, but something about the caption made my chest tighten. The man's name was Khalid Al-Farsi, described as a private security contractor with regional operations, and the article mentioned investigations into arms dealing and surveillance technology sales. This wasn't water infrastructure. This wasn't political activism about corruption. This was something darker, something Rashid had never mentioned. When I asked Julia casually what she knew about Al-Farsi, she lowered her voice and said the Foreign Office suspected he was involved in providing surveillance technology to governments that used it to track dissidents, journalists, and activists across multiple countries. "Nasty stuff," Julia said. "The kind of technology that gets people killed." That evening I confronted Rashid, showing him a photograph on my phone. His face went through that same sequence: surprise, calculation, resignation. But this time the story he told was different. Yes, that was his father. No, his father wasn't a water infrastructure advocate. That was a cover. Khalid Al-Farsi did work in security, but not arms dealing, Rashid insisted. His father consulted for governments on legitimate security matters, advising on technology and protocols. The investigations Julia mentioned were misunderstandings, Western bias against Gulf business practices. "You have to understand," Rashid said. "In our region, security and politics are complicated. My father has enemies because he's successful, and they spread rumors to damage him. I never told you because I knew how it would sound, how you judge him based on Western assumptions about our culture." He was angry now, defensive, accusing me of believing foreign propaganda over the man I supposedly loved. The argument escalated, words said that couldn't be unsaid, and I left his flat confused and hurt, unsure whether I was being manipulated or unreasonable. I did what anyone in my position might. I investigated. Using my law firm's database access and language skills, I searched for information about Khalid Al-Farsi and found a web far more disturbing than Julia's brief description. Al-Farsi's company, registered in Dubai with branches across the Gulf, sold sophisticated surveillance technology to governments with documented human rights abuses. The technology included spyware that could remotely access phones and computers, tracking systems that could monitor vehicles and individuals across borders, and facial recognition systems integrated with databases of dissidents and activists. Multiple human rights organizations had named Al-Farsi's company in reports about how activists had been tracked and, in several cases, arrested or disappeared. One report detailed how a journalist in London had been surveilled using Al-Farsi's technology before being detained upon returning to their home country. The scales fell from my eyes with sickening clarity. Rashid's aversion to Windows wasn't about being watched by his father's enemies. It was about avoiding surveillance systems his father sold, systems that might capture his image and location. But why? If his father ran the company, why would Rashid need to hide? The answer came from an unexpected source, a message on LinkedIn from someone claiming to be Rashid's former classmate from Muscat. The message was cryptic. "If you're involved with Rashid Al-Farsi, you should know the truth. He's not who he says. Meet me." We met in a crowded Starbucks, and the woman, who introduced herself as Amira, told me a story that shattered everything. Rashid was indeed Khalid Al-Farsi's son, but he'd fled Oman 5 years ago after threatening to expose his father's business to international authorities. Rashid had worked briefly in the family company after university and had been horrified by what he discovered. The technology wasn't just sold to governments for legitimate security purposes, but was marketed specifically for its ability to suppress dissent. Rashid had copied files, contacted human rights organizations, and prepared to become a whistleblower. But before he could act, his father had learned of his plans. What happened next was chilling. Khalid Al-Farsi had used his own surveillance technology to track Rashid, to monitor his communications, to document his every move. He threatened to have Rashid arrested on fabricated charges if he didn't remain silent, forcing him into exile in London with the understanding that he was always watched, always one step from being dragged back. Rashid lives in fear, Amira explained, because his father's technology can find him anywhere. The only way he survives is by staying invisible. No photographs, no location data, no presence near windows where facial recognition systems might capture his image from drones or security cameras. His father's company has contracts with multiple governments, including in the UK. Rashid is never safe. I returned to Rashid's flat that night without calling ahead, my mind reeling from Amira's revelations. I found him packing, his belongings sorted into boxes and suitcases. He looked up when I entered, unsurprised, and said simply, "You know now." I asked why he'd never told me the truth, and his answer was devastating. "Because telling you made you complicit. If you knew I was a potential whistleblower against my father, you'd be in danger too. His reach is everywhere. The technology his company sells, governments across the Middle East and beyond use it. If they knew you had information about their surveillance capabilities, about how they track dissidents, you'd become a target. I kept you away from windows to protect you, to keep your face out of databases, to prevent anyone from connecting you to me." The careful choreography of our relationship suddenly made terrible sense. Every precaution, every restriction, every moment of caution had been Rashid trying to protect both himself and me from a father who'd turned surveillance technology into a weapon against his own son. I asked the obvious question: "Why did you start a relationship with me at all if it was so dangerous?" Rashid's smile was sad. "Because loneliness is its own kind of death, and I thought I could love you without dragging you into this nightmare." I was wrong. Over the following hours, Rashid explained the full scope of his situation. His father's company had recently secured a major contract with a European government to provide security consultation, which Rashid believed was cover for deploying the same surveillance systems used in the Gulf. Rashid had been contacted by journalists and human rights investigators asking him to provide testimony about his father's business, to serve as a whistleblower who could explain from inside knowledge how the technology was marketed and deployed. He'd been resisting because going public meant accepting that he'd never be safe again, but recent events had forced his hand. A close friend in Oman, another person who'd considered exposing Khalid Al-Farsi's operations, had been arrested on terrorism charges that everyone knew were fabricated. Rashid felt responsible, felt that his silence had cost his friend freedom or worse. He decided to cooperate with a major international investigation being conducted by Amnesty International and several European media outlets. "But once I do," Rashid said, "I can never stop hiding. My father will use every resource to silence me, and anyone close to me becomes leverage he can exploit. That's why I'm leaving, why I'm breaking up with you. You need to have nothing to do with me when this story breaks. Distance is the only protection I can offer you now." I wanted to argue, to insist we could face this together, but Rashid's fear was contagious and his logic irrefutable. Loving him meant becoming a vulnerability he couldn't afford, a way for his father to apply pressure. The cruelest twist was that separating was Rashid's final act of care. He gave me documents, copies of the files he'd stolen from his father's company, evidence of sales contracts, and technical specifications of surveillance systems. "Give these to a lawyer," he said. "Not at your firm, someone independent. Tell them you found them in a cafe, that you don't know their origin. If anyone asks about me, say we broke up months ago and you haven't seen me. Delete every photo, every message, every trace of our relationship." His paranoia no longer seemed excessive but essential. Before he left, Rashid did one final thing. He walked to the curtained window, pulled the fabric aside slightly, and stood in the pale London morning light streaming through. "I've kept you away from windows for a year," he said. "To keep you invisible, to keep you safe. But I wanted you to see this once, me choosing to be visible, to stop hiding, even though it terrifies me. Because some truths are more important than safety, and I should have trusted you with mine from the beginning." He let the curtain fall, kissed my forehead, and walked out carrying 2 suitcases that contained everything he could take from a life he'd built in exile. The story broke 3 months later, major investigative pieces in The Guardian, Der Spiegel, and multiple outlets detailing how a Dubai-based surveillance company led by Khalid Al-Farsi had sold technology to authoritarian governments across 3 continents. Rashid was the unnamed source, described only as a former company insider whose testimony and documents had enabled the investigation. The articles detailed how the technology had been used to track dissidents in Europe, how journalists had been surveilled before being detained in their home countries, how the systems integrated facial recognition, location tracking, and communications monitoring into comprehensive surveillance networks. Multiple governments faced criticism for purchasing the technology, and international calls for sanctions against Al-Farsi's company intensified. But Rashid himself vanished. I searched for any trace, any signal that he was safe, and found nothing. Friends said they'd heard he'd relocated to Canada under a new identity. Others claimed he was in witness protection. Some whispered darker possibilities. I gave the documents he'd left me to a human rights lawyer as instructed, claiming I'd found them abandoned, maintaining the fiction that Rashid and I had separated long before. My role remained invisible, just as he'd intended. Years passed. I moved to a new law firm, started a new relationship with someone whose life held no secrets or surveillance, tried to build normalcy on foundations that felt stable. But I never stopped thinking about Rashid, about love shaped by fear, about the windows he'd kept me from to protect me from dangers I hadn't understood. I followed developments in surveillance technology and human rights, reading articles about activists tracked across borders and dissidents disappeared after digital monitoring. Each story felt personal, a reminder that Rashid's paranoia had been earned through knowledge most people never acquire. Then, 5 years after he'd walked out of his London flat, I received an envelope with no return address, postmarked from Toronto. Inside was a single photograph of a man standing at a window overlooking a harbor, his face turned toward light, unafraid. On the back, in handwriting I recognized, was written, "Sometimes the bravest thing is choosing to be seen. Thank you for understanding why I kept you in shadows." That was the last communication I ever received, but it was enough. Rashid had survived, found some measure of freedom, and was living a life where windows no longer represented danger but possibility. The irony wasn't lost on me. I believed him when he said he kept me from windows to protect me, and in a sense he had, but the deeper truth was that by keeping me invisible, he'd given me a gift his father's surveillance technology couldn't touch, the freedom to live unmonitored, unwatched, untracked. In a world where privacy was increasingly impossible, where surveillance capitalism and state monitoring converged to record every movement, Rashid had chosen to sacrifice our relationship to preserve my anonymity. That was love, too, just expressed in a language I'd needed time to learn to read. I believe my lover from Oman, and discovering why he always kept me away from windows taught me that sometimes the greatest acts of love are the ones that push us away for our own protection, even when every instinct wants to hold close. In the end, the windows weren't about what I couldn't see. They were about ensuring that those watching would never see me, and in that invisibility, Rashid had given me freedom he'd lost himself.